All right, well, we're going to get started. Matt, can you start us with a word of prayer?
Father, we are so thankful to be able to come and study your word. For you are the word, you are the truth, you are the life. And we ask that you just anoint Pastor, lead and guide and direct him by and through with the Holy Spirit. We pray that we will receive what we need and take away from here and be able to apply it to our lives. Lord, we are looking at some dark times, but again, you are our hope. And all of our hope rests in you alone. So we thank you today, Jesus, for all that you do for us. And we praise your holy name, for it is in that perfect name.
How many of you remember the name Lee Atwater? Lee Atwater. He was probably one of the greatest political minds in America in the 20th century. He was known for his keen insight, but he was also known for his questionable political tactics as well. And he said that he considered politics to be war. And what he did for the benefit of his candidate. And really, his gospel was to win at all cost. And because of that attitude, he made a lot of enemies along the way. And so he considered those enemies, though, trophies of what he was doing. But then one day, his whole world just came to a screeching halt. He found out that he had a brain tumor. And so he started seeing life differently. And in that time period, shortly after he found out that he had a brain tumor, he gave his life to Jesus Christ. And I'll never forget, he was on the 700 Club, and he was being interviewed by Pat Robertson. And I was watching that interview, and how much you could tell this man had changed as he was sharing the gospel. And he made up his mind that he was going to go out and share the gospel with everybody that he made an enemy along the way, and was going to ask for forgiveness. And the thing about it was, a lot of people were listening to what he had to say. And after he did that, it wasn't shortly after he found out he had a brain tumor that he passed away. So what lessons can we draw from the life of Lee Atwater? What would you say are some of the lessons we can learn from his life?
Every day that we have is precious.
Every day that we have is precious, isn't it? He spent the first part of his life really pleasing man, didn't he? And isn't it easy to do that? Isn't it easy for someone to want to spend their life pleasing other people? Also, we can learn from his life, you know what? The gospel can become tainted when we have a personal agenda. People are going to see our personal agenda. They're going to miss the gospel message. So our lifestyle is going to offend people if we don't set our hearts on Jesus. And we need to realize that. And so what we're kind of set up the context for the verses that we're going to look at tonight. Remember, we had critics that came in and they were criticizing Paul, and there were false teachers that had arisen in the churches of Galatia. In other words, Paul had gone through the region of Galatia, and he had planted churches all over that region, and now there were false teachers that had come behind them, people we call Judaizers. These were people that had been Pharisees, very strict Jews, that believed that you had to become a Jew before you could become a Christian. You had to follow all of those rules and regulations. But they were also questioning Paul's call to preach the gospel. Can you imagine somebody else questioning somebody's call into the ministry? And so they said that he was a self-made minister. That the reason that he was doing it was because he was being a minister for his livelihood and for greedy purposes. He wanted to take advantage of people, and he wanted to make money off of that. And so we're going to look today in chapter 1 at verses 10 through 16. And Paul sets out to show the difference of his old life and the old message that he believed in and how he had radically changed his life. And so I kind of say that his story was that he went from a terrorist to an evangelist. And so I want to look at 3 ways Paul's life was transformed. And the first, he sought to please God, not man. So if somebody could loudly, because we are taking this, read verse 10.
For am I now trying to persuade people or God? Or am I striving to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ.
So the critics of Paul were saying that he was inconsistent. He was seeking the favor and approval of men and not God. He was striving to please men instead of God. And he was living by the law when he was around Jews. And then he was living a more loose lifestyle when he was among the unsaved and among the Gentiles. And so he's saying one thing, they're saying he's saying one thing to this group, and he's saying something else totally different to this group. And he's doing this to secure support from the people. That's what the critics say that he's doing. And so Paul, what I love about him, he doesn't mix words, does he? He just sometimes just goes straight into it. And we've seen that already in this book of Galatians, is he's not mixing words. He is very abrupt, he's very bold, and he fires 2 questions to his critic. What are the 2 questions that he fires at them?
Am I trying to persuade people or God?
Okay, for am I trying to persuade people or God? And then the other one is,
Am I striving to please them?
so what startling statement did Paul also make in this passage?
He said if he was trying to please people, he would be a servant of Christ.
Okay, so he agreed with them, didn't he? He said, you know what? I used to be a people pleaser. You're right, I used to be a people pleaser. There was a time that I sought the favor and approval of men. But no more. No more. Now I'm seeking just the favor of God. Just trying to please God. So what do people do to please others? What are some of the things people do to please others?
Give gifts.
Give gifts, okay? Yeah, if I give you a gift, maybe I'll butter you up a little bit and you do something for me, right? Okay?
Be kind to them.
Be kind, okay?
Say what they want to hear, not what you think.
Okay, say what they want to hear, okay? I'll never forget, I saw this one time in action when I was young. I somehow got roped into an Amway meeting. And our tennis pro was trying to please the guy that was above him in the pyramid. And they had invited us to this like covered-ish supper thing. And the tennis pro got the last deviled egg. But his guy right ahead of him wanted a deviled egg. He said, oh, no, don't take my deviled egg. Why don't you take it? No. People pleasing, right? We know what people pleasing looks like. So why would someone seek to be a people pleaser? What do they really want?
Approval.
Want approval,
Advancement.
maybe acceptance, approval, recognition, honor, position, maybe even wealth. There are a number of reasons why somebody would want to please somebody else and be a people pleaser, right? So what about Paul's former life suggests that he was a people pleaser? Remember, he was a Jew. He was a Pharisee. He was a very learned man. And what was he doing? He says he was. And how did he show that he was? Man, he was admired for his zeal as a Jew, right? I mean, he received glory from the other Jews for the way he was persecuting the Christians, right? He was successful. He was an upper coming among the Pharisees. I mean, he was heading for being on the Sanhedrin Council one day, wasn't he? That's where he was heading, and people admired this young man. So now, how is Paul saying his life has changed? He's a servant of Christ. He's no longer seeking those things that he once did. They no longer matter to him. They're not important to him. The only thing that he wants is the favor and approval of God. He's not looking for it from men. So how do believers seek to please men instead of God? How do believers seek to please men instead of God today? Okay, go along with the flow. Okay. Okay. Because they want to be accepted with people around him instead of standing up for what they believe in. Okay, yeah, all right.
Not calling people out for what they're doing.
Okay, not calling people out for what they're doing. Okay,
But it'd be about it.
okay. How else? People, believers, seek to please men instead of God. What kind of things they do? Can you think of a time when you sought to please people and not God? I think we're honest, we've all been there. We've all been at times when we just want to fit in, right? So maybe we go along with the crowd. Maybe we don't say something when something bothers us and we don't take a stand for that. You know, maybe we're at the water cooler and somebody tells an off-color joke and we just listen to it instead of, right? There are times that we're looking for that approval and we can all fall into it. What would you do differently if you had another chance, though? What would you do differently? Or would you do anything differently?
Like if I could go back in time, is that what you mean?
Right.
One thing I would do differently is not bully people on the bus.
Okay. All right.
Bullied a little girl on the bus. And I didn't really apologize to her until we were both out of high school.
Okay. Good.
And, you know, then she said to me, oh, that was when we were kids. I said, I knew better. And I carried it way too far. So I would use that differently.
Okay. And bullies do it, again, because they want people to admire them. They want power, right?
And they also do it for their own insecurities.
Insecurities, you're right. Yeah. So there's a lot of reasons that they do it, and but a lot of times it is to seek approval somewhere else. Okay? Or to fill in for your insecurities, right? What should be your motivation to please God? What should be your motivation? Do what? Yeah, your heart. Yeah, I mean, if you got a heart for God, you have a love and gratitude for Him, then that should be your motivation, shouldn't it? Simply that. So what does Paul mean by, if I were trying to please men, I wouldn't be a servant of Christ? What does he mean by that?
You can't be both.
You can't be both.
You can't be a servant of God and a servant of man.
Okay. If you're trying to please men, then you're neglecting over here, right? I think Paul learned something that every minister knows. We had a few ministers in here. Can you please everybody, Bob, when you were a pastor? Matt, could you please everybody when you were a pastor?
No.
No. And I think every minister learns that. I think we know that. Paul's just saying, you know what? I can't please everybody. I know that. And if I was trying to please everybody, then I wouldn't be a servant of Christ. I wouldn't be a minister because there's no way to do that. There's no point in even trying to do that If I wanted to please men, then I'd just go do something else. I'd just go do something else, something a little more politically correct, because there's no way to do that in ministry, and be in ministry. We're all in ministry, okay? We're all in ministry. The second thing that we see about Paul is he proclaimed the gospel. Somebody want to read verses 11 and 12?
For I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel preached by me is not of human origin. For I did not receive it from a human source, and I was not taught it, but it came by a revelation of Jesus Christ.
So Paul's critics were saying he wasn't a true apostle because he wasn't a follower of Jesus when Jesus was on the earth. Remember, we said that was one of the things, the definition of apostle. An apostle was someone that has seen the risen Christ, and it was also someone that was called for a specific thing by the risen Christ. And so they're saying that his teaching was a man-made gospel, and he was teaching it to mislead others. So how does Paul handle that criticism? You're not a true apostle, and you're preaching a man-made gospel, and you're just trying to mislead people. How does Paul handle that criticism in these verses? This is a crucial thing in his argument. It says it came from Jesus. So he goes on to explain it's not a man-made, the gospel I'm preaching is not man-made. It's not a gospel created in man's mind, from men's ideas, or from their dreams, or from their imagination. He tells them it wasn't a human thing. It didn't originate with man. The gospel he preached wasn't a message handed down by tradition. It wasn't something that he learned in some kind of educational institute. It wasn't something taught to him by man. Where did he receive it, Lynn? You just told us. Where did he receive that gospel? Directly from Jesus.
The thing about it, Pastor, is that, amen. The thing about it is that Paul, after his seeing Jesus on the road, after Jesus confronted him, and after his eyesight came back, he left. He left for approximately 3 years.
Yeah, and he's going to tell us that next week. He goes to Arabia, right?
And he studied in the wilderness, and the Holy Spirit, and I'm getting ahead.
Yeah, you are, but you're right. That's exactly what we're going to see next week. Is that he's going to tell us he went to Arabia and he studied it. But he tells us right here that he had a revelation by Jesus Christ. Now, what is a divine revelation? What is that? A divine revelation is a truth that is shared by God to man, a truth that man never knew. Okay? It's a truth that's shared from God to man that man never knew. So here's the crucial note. Paul's called the ministry and the gospel which he preached rested on what? They're saying you weren't really called. You're preaching a man-made gospel. You're not really an apostle. Everything that he was preaching rested on what? Did Jesus really reveal it to him? Did Jesus really give him that revelation? Isn't everything, his whole defense is based on that, isn't it? Because if that's not true, then what is Paul? If it's not true, if he didn't really get his gospel directly from Jesus, from a revelation from Jesus,
It would be a
who is
lie.
he?
It'd be a lie.
He'd be a liar. He'd be a liar. He wasn't a true minister. He would be a fraud. He would be a deceiver, wouldn't he? But Paul, time and time and time again in the Scriptures, tells us and declares that he received his gospel directly from Jesus. I'll give you some passages. We're not going to look at them tonight, but I'll give you some passages. You want to dig further into that. Go to 1 Corinthians 2:7. Go to 1 Timothy 2:4. And go to Titus 1:3. And you'll see those are just three other examples of him very plainly telling us that he got his revelation directly from Jesus.
What was the Titus?
1:3. So here's my question to you guys. Do you believe Paul? Okay. Do you believe he got it directly from Jesus? So why do you believe him? It's easy to say we believe, but why do you believe?
See the example in his life.
Okay, you see the example in his life. Did he preach with power? The thing is, Paul even said, I'm not a very good speaker. Remember that? He wrote that in a letter. I came with you with much fear and trembling. You remember when he wrote that? He often said he wasn't a great speaker, but man, when he spoke, people got saved. There was power when he preached. Isn't that proof right there? Man, he completely gave his life to this. You'd think anybody lived a harder Christian life than Paul? What all did he go through? Beatings. Shipwreck. Stoning. And we're talking about with rocks. Prison. Whips. Snake bites. Chains. Being cold. Being hungry.
If Paul hadn't have done that, he would have been a rich man living an easy life.
Right.
So to me, that just tells me something moved in Paul's life to make him what he was.
He was that up-and-comer, wasn't he? I mean, he was going to the top of the Jewish religion. He was going somewhere. And you're right. He would have been a very wealthy man. He was a very smart man. He was very ambitious. He was a go-getter, right? He gave all that up for the gospel. So he completely gave his life to it. His word saw people come to Jesus. I mean, just about every time he went into a city, what is the first thing he did? He went into the synagogue. He preached to the Jews because he didn't give up on the Jews. And it always says some got saved. Then he went to the Gentiles. So everywhere he went, people were getting saved. And then people's lives were changed. Think about how many lives that Paul influenced and impacted. You know what? No man-made gospel will change a life. No man-made gospel will change a life. Y'all ever remember hearing about or reading about the great evangelist George Whitefield? Remember him? Well, while he was out shaking England and doing all this revival preaching and all these people were getting saved, one of the things about Whitefield was the fact that they said that he could preach to a crowd of 20,000 people with no amplification, and people could all hear him. I'm like, I always want to just hear his voice. What was that voice like? I even read one person had put on there in their notes that it was a journal at the time that they were 2 miles downstream in a creek in a boat and could hear him preaching. Think about that. So he's out preaching, and then this baronet said this to a friend. She said, this man Whitefield, he's a truly great man. Surely he will be the founder of a new religion. A new religion, explained her friend. Yes, said the baronet. If it's not a new religion, what do you call it? And her friend says, I say a bit that it is nothing but the old religion revived and heated with divine energy and a man who really means what he says. Folks, old-fashioned gospel produces old-fashioned conversions. The gospel does not change. The gospel that was preached 2,000 years ago should be the same gospel that's preached today. Remember last week we talked about, Paul said that these Judaizers were coming in and they were preaching a different gospel. And Paul said, no, there's just one gospel, and it's the gospel of Jesus Christ. We never change that message. We don't have to change that message, do we? That's the message that we preach. You call it old-fashioned, you call it whatever it is. It's the gospel. It has the power to change lives. So Whitefield was a successful evangelist. Why? Because he preached with conviction. He preached with a divine energy. You know what he preached with, Mike? He preached with the power of the Holy Spirit. And he preached with great energy. And his life proclaimed what he was preaching. People would look at his life and it matched up with what he was saying. Now that's very similar to Paul, isn't it? So we got to ask ourselves, what kind of gospel does our life proclaim? What kind of gospel does our life proclaim? A new religion or the only true gospel of Jesus? What are we proclaiming? What kind of man-made gospels do we see in our culture today?
Prosperity.
Prosperity. We talked about that in good detail last week, didn't we? Prosperity gospel. Name and claim it.
Most of them is a man-made gospel.
It's a man-made? Absolutely it is.
Buddhism.
Buddhism.
Mormonism,
Mormonism.
Jehovah's Witness.
Jehovah's Witness. These are all man-made gospels that are occurring in our culture today. So, what distinguishes the gospel of Christ from a man-made gospel? What distinguishes it?
In most of the man-made Gospels, it's Christ plus,
So it's Christ plus.
not just Christ alone.
And
What-
empty tomb.
An empty tomb.
Empty tomb.
Where's Buddha?
He did.
Don't care.
He's in a grave, isn't he?
He's in a grave somewhere.
Where's Muhammad? Where's Joseph Smith? He's in a grave. Where's Charles Russell? In a grave. Where's Jesus?
In heaven.
He's in the heaven, the right hand of God the Father Almighty. His grave's empty.
Amen.
We have a Savior that overcame death. And he said in John 14:6, what? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except by me. That's the gospel message. There's only one way to heaven. And you know what? We have to stand on that. So, if someone were to ask you what are the basic elements of the gospel, what would you say? What are the basic elements? What are the things that all of us need to believe?
There is only one God,
Okay, there is only one God.
and we know that He loves each and every one of us.
Okay, and He loves us. All right.
He came, He died, He rose again.
Came, He died, He rose again. Okay,
And He's the only way.
He's the only way. Y'all have heard me explain the gospel just with the book, with just John 3:16, right? He loved, He gave, we believe, we live. That's the gospel message, isn't it? Very, very simple. The third thing is His life was radically changed. Somebody want to read verses 13 through 16?
For you have heard about my former way of life in Judaism. I intensely persecuted God's church and tried to destroy it. I advanced in Judaism beyond many contemporaries among my people because I was extremely zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. But when God, who from my mother's womb set me apart and called me by His grace, was pleased to reveal His Son in me, so that I could preach Him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone.
So, what did Paul try to establish by bringing up his personal history here? What's he trying to establish here by doing that? He's kind of given us a little bit of his testimony.
Or bonding.
Okay, maybe he's trying to bond with people. Here's where I'm coming from. Look, I know you're saying these nasty things about me, but let me tell you where I'm really coming from. Let me tell you my testimony. Let me tell you what God's done in my life. Because you know what? Nobody can refute somebody else's testimony, can they? You can't. You tell me your story, I can't say God didn't do that, right? You know God did that. So he's telling his story. So what radical changes are clearly seen in Paul's life after he met Christ? What are the changes? I said in the beginning, he went from terrorist to evangelist. Explain to me how he went from a terrorist to an evangelist.
Not the man he used to be.
He's not the man he used to be. So he used to do what to the church?
Yeah.
Okay. He persecuted. His exact words. He intensely persecuted God's church. Okay. He killed people. Okay. So anyone that got in his way, right? So he wanted to wipe the Christian church off the face of the earth. He was a devout Jew. He believed that. And he believed that the Christians were a sect that needed to go away. That's how devout a Jew he was. But after he learned the error of his ways, that Jesus Christ was the way, he completely changed. I mean, Christians, how did they feel about Paul before he was converted? They were scared to death of him. You just mentioned the name of it. Remember Ananias on his conversion story? When God sent a vision to Ananias, I want you to go to Straight Street and I want you to go, there's a man named Paul. And he's like, whoa, you're talking about the Paul, the one that's persecuting the Christians? That's the Paul we're talking about. You want me to go do what? Christians were scared to death of him, right? His goal was to devastate, to destroy, to ruin, to wipe out the Christian church. That's what his goal was. So here's what way Paul saw himself. Paul saw himself as the supreme example of self-righteousness. Now let's think about that for a moment. He saw himself as a perfect Jew. Like all the Pharisees did. They saw themselves as the perfect Jew, and he was committed to all the Jewish traditions. He was committed to all the Jewish rituals. Even the 613 laws that they came up with, the Pharisaical laws, he was completely committed to that. So think about it. Before Paul's conversion, he had done all the right things except for one. What do you think that was? He's doing all the right things but one.
Accepting Christ as his Savior.
He went in the wrong direction. He missed that. He missed who Christ was before he got converted. But he's doing all the things the Old Testament said to do. There's a spaceship called Mariner 2. Remember what Mariner 2 did? Mariner 2 made big headlines when it completed a 36 million mile trip to Venus. And we learned a lot about Venus because of Mariner 2. Now, if there's a Mariner 2, that implies something, doesn't it? Must have been a Mariner 1. Well, we don't really remember a lot about Mariner 1. You know why we don't remember a lot about Mariner 1? It attempted the very same journey. It was going to Venus. Anybody remember what happened that time? There was nothing wrong with Mariner 1. Took off just like it was supposed to. Everything worked on the spaceship. But it went off course and missed the mark by tens of thousands of miles. And the reason that it did that, you used to do some programming, didn't you, Wayne? They left out a hyphen. One hyphen and put in the code in. One hyphen caused it to miss the mark by tens of thousands of miles. And so the missile misbehaved. It didn't do anything wrong. It just was programmed wrong. What was the damage from that? It set back the whole Mariner mission off by 2 years. It was 2 years later before the Mariner 2 went. It cost us taxpayers $18 million. That's what the cost of a hyphen was. How was Paul thrown off course? How was Paul thrown off course?
His encounter with Christ on the Damascus Road.
Okay, that got him back on it, but what got him off? He had this misguided sense of self-righteousness. So he believed he could work his way to heaven. He believed that if I'm good enough, I'll please God. Self-righteousness. Folks, we need to all know we are sinners saved purely by God's grace. And our best 15 minutes on this planet wouldn't get us in heaven. But yet that's the way Paul thought. And so he was misguided by his sense of self-righteousness. What was that hype that got him back on track? And maybe I asked the question wrong. That was the cross, wasn't it? It was Jesus. See, without the cross, we'd all be forever lost in space. We'd have missed the mark by a bunch. So Paul's radical change included 4 significant points. The first one is God had set Paul apart and called him by his grace. Now, what is grace? It's a word we throw out there a lot of times. What is grace?
Great reward at Christ's expense.
Right, that's a good definition.
God's riches at Christ's expense.
Okay, that's good. Anybody else got a good definition of
Something
grace?
we don't deserve.
Something you don't deserve. Getting something that we don't deserve. You ever gotten something you didn't deserve?
That includes spankings. or whipping.
Yeah, I didn't deserve any of those, did you? Yeah, somehow I feel like we're lying, don't you? We're deceivers.
Not me.
God's unmerited favor. So it was God's grace that saved him from this life of self-righteousness and this path of destruction that he was going down. So God had called Paul before he was even born. You believe God's called us all before we were ever born? That God has a mission for us before we were ever born? You know, if we were to go look in Ephesians chapter 2, we would see that. That he tells us he's given us a purpose that we had for us before we were ever born. They're great works for us. So he knew what he wanted Paul to do. So Paul's call and ministry were not due to Paul, and that's what they were saying, right? Well, they were saying, well, Paul just wanted to be a minister because he could gain from it. Well, y'all heard what Wayne was saying. We were talking. Man, Paul would have been much wealthier never to go down this path. This path didn't make Paul wealthy. The path he was on was going to make him wealthy. He didn't call himself into the ministry. God called him and called him by his grace. Think about that for a moment. Whatever it is that God's purpose is for you, you're doing it by God's grace. God gave you that. God planned that for you. And we shouldn't take that for granted, whatever that calling is, no matter what it is. I love talking about Elsie because Elsie and Buddy, they keep our church clean. But that's a ministry for them. That is their ministry. They take pride, and it comes from the heart, doesn't it? It's your ministry. And that's the thing about it. God gave you that ministry by grace. And so that's what we have to always remember. So God had set Paul apart and called him by his grace. And then the B here is God called Paul to reveal Jesus to others. How do we reveal Jesus to other people? How do we do that? How did Paul do it?
Tell them about it.
You couldn't get Paul to shut up about Jesus, could you? I mean, think about all the people that Paul revealed Jesus to. Who were some of the people that he revealed Jesus to?
And
Timothy. I'm sinking again.
Lydia.
Lydia? Yeah. Who else? Just in Philippi. Lydia. The demon-possessed woman. The Philippian jailer. When him and Silas were in that prison, singing and praising God, they were witnessing and telling everybody in that jail about Jesus, weren't they? So prisoners. Lydia was what?
Wealthy woman.
She was a wealthy woman. She dealt in purple. She was very, very wealthy. The demon-possessed woman was a slave to a jailer, blue-collar worker. When he was arrested originally and he was taken to Felix, governor of Judea, he preached to him. Herod Agrippa, Drusilla, royalty. Why did he want to plead his case to Nero? He wanted to share the gospel. Remember when he was in prison, he was present between two guards. He was preaching the gospel. Can you imagine being chained to Paul? I was like, no, I'm tired. I'm tired of it. I don't want to hear it anymore, Paul. No! Because he's going to tell them the gospel, isn't it? Anybody that came in contact with him. He told Jews and Gentiles. He told everybody he came across the gospel.
He told the 7 churches.
He told the 7 churches. Everyone he came across, he revealed. God called Paul to reveal Jesus to others. Did he do that? Absolutely. God called Paul to preach Christ. Did he preach Christ? And then God called Paul to seek his gospel from God alone. See, Paul was not to seek the gospel from men. God alone is the source of the gospel. Does that mean that all believers are not to learn from other people? Is that what that means? No, that's not what that means. Now, why does that not what that means? Why is it okay to learn the true gospel from other people? We just don't want to learn a man-made gospel from somebody, okay? Does that make sense? That's why we got to be careful that what we hear and what we're being taught is the truth. And so it's a warning that God's saying, Paul, you know what? Your gospel comes from me. That's what you teach. You don't teach anything else. It's okay for us to teach the true gospel, isn't it, to other people? So, do you believe your past life keeps you from changing your life now? Anybody believe that? That your past life keeps you from changing your life now?
No, but there's a lot of people there that interfere in your change.
You're right. I'll never forget that when I was, this is years ago, I was in my 20s, and there was a guy in my Sunday school class whose boss got saved. Now, I think it's important to the story. His boss was a black man, okay? And I think it's important to the story because he wouldn't come to church with my buddy because of that. And I don't know why. We kept inviting him, but he never went to church. He got saved, and I mean, he read his Bible, and he was serious about this. And he told me one day that he would go to a party, and his wife was still a partier, and she was always making fun of him for accepting Christ. And he would go to this party, and people would come up to him and go, man, you used to be fun. You used to drink, and you used to be the life of the party, and you're just boring now. And so he was really struggling with that life change, right? Letting go of his past. But we never could get him to come to church. I don't know whatever happened to him. We tried hard to get him to come to church or some church or join some church. So why do people believe that? Why do people sometimes feel like their past keeps them from changing their life now?
Believe a lie.
They believe in a lie, aren't they? We don't have to be who we were, do we? We can change. You ever seen somebody that used to be a drug addict and they're not now? You ever seen somebody used to be an alcoholic but they're not now? Have you ever seen somebody that used to be this and they're not now? You ever seen somebody that completely changed? How did they do it? They had to quit believing the lie, didn't they? The lie of the devil. Have you done anything so bad that God cannot forgive you? Anybody? Isn't that wonderful? There ain't nothing that we can't do that was so bad that God can't forgive us. Because if that was true, Paul was in trouble. Y'all ever killed a bunch of Christians? Paul was a pretty wretched guy, wasn't he? And God forgave him. What actions can you take to bring this change about? Or let me ask this. What is the secret of a radically changed life? What's the secret to that? You were to ask Paul, what's the secret? What's the secret to your radically changed life? What is it?
Jesus Christ.
It's Jesus Christ, isn't it? It's a very simple answer, isn't it? Jesus Christ is what changed my life. When I met him on the road to that, Paul would say, when I met him on the road to Damascus, I immediately saw that I was in the wrong direction. And he got me on the right direction. He is the secret to a radically changed life. And when you meet Jesus, your life will never be the same. If you're on trial for being a Christian, if you're on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? I want you to think about that. If you were to be put on trial for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? All right. What did you get out of this passage and how can you apply it?
What was the incident be?
God called Paul to seek his gospel from God alone.
One thing Matt shared really speaks to my heart, because Satan does try to come at us with lies. And the Bible says, I think there's a verse that says, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So we have to, once we meet Jesus and we have him as our Savior, we have to choose to believe what is true from his holy word and walk in that truth. As we think and walk, that's how we're going to be.
Okay. And why does Satan want to deceive us like that?
He's a liar. He'll never tell us the truth about anything.
Okay.
He's the father of all lies.
And he doesn't want us to follow Jesus, does
He
he?
already knows, oh, well, they're saved, but I can keep them confused and frustrated all the time.
Yeah. I can keep them from leading anybody else to Christ. I could ruin their testimony. Right? Okay. Anybody else? What did you get out of this passage and how could you apply it?
I think we need to remove ourselves out of the way and make sure that Jesus is our we are truly worshiping one or the other, ourselves or Jesus Christ.
Right.
That selfishness and that pride
good, man. Anybody else?
We need Paul's sincerity, his desire to drive. We sit back on our church pew and let everybody else take care of things. We need to be up and doing it.
Right.
Paul didn't sit in church and let people preach to him.
Paul was always doing something, wasn't he? And think about it. Paul would go to a town and they'd stone him, and what would he do? He'd dust himself off and he'd go to the next town. They'd beat him up there, and what'd he do? Dust himself off, he'd go to the next town. You're talking about weebles wobble and they don't fall down. That was Paul, right? Think about that. That's because it meant something. It was true. It was real. It was sincere.
Is the gospel around you, or is it personal?
Yeah, that's good. That's a good way of looking at it. That's good.
I like what he says here. It just made me think. Because I was extremely zealous for the traditions of my ancestors. Traditions don't get us to heaven. You can do everything you can, but your traditions and traditions that you follow don't get you to heaven. It's that personal relationship with Christ that completely, radically changed him. And that has to happen to us.
And what does that tell you about his personality? That he had such a zeal for the Jewish faith, but then when he learned the truth of Jesus Christ, he had equal zeal for Christianity. I mean, that was something about his personality, and I think that's one of the reasons that God makes us certain ways. He needed somebody that was just motivated, that just had a passion and ambition to move forward.
Paul was all in all the time.
All in, all the time. Okay. Anybody else?
I think about that when he says he was set apart. Like God set him up.
Yeah, I mean, it was in his personality. That's the kind of personality that you would need to do what Paul did, right? You don't need somebody that goes, man, them people tried to stone me. I'm going home. You know? First person throwing a rock at me, I'm out of here, right? If Paul would have done that, we never would have heard about Paul, would we? Oh, did y'all ever hear about the evangelist that got a rock thrown at him, went home? That don't make for a very good story, does it? That doesn't change people's lives. That doesn't share the gospel. So he made his personality the way it's supposed to be. His DNA was exactly the way God wanted it to be.
He knew to die was gain too.
Yeah, to die was gain. And he tells us that in Philippians, doesn't he? All right, anybody else? Andrew, you want to turn that camera off? We're going to do a prayer list. So who do we need to pray for?